Hello everyone, welcome back to Global Echo Reports. The night over the Persian Gulf was unusually silent, the kind of silence that feels unnatural, almost like the world itself was holding its breath. Massive oil tankers floated slowly across dark waters, their steel bodies carrying millions of barrels of crude oil, the lifeline of the global economy. Crew members worked quietly under dim lights, unaware that history was about to change in a matter of minutes. Far beyond the horizon, something moved. Unseen, almost invisible, small drones skimmed across the surface of the water. They were fast, low, and deadly. Within moments, the silence shattered into chaos. A massive explosion erupted on the side of a tanker, flames rising into the night sky like a signal to the world that the Gulf was no longer safe. Another blast followed, then another. Panic spread across multiple vessels as alarms screamed and sailors rushed to save themselves. This was not an accident. This was a message. In recent weeks, tensions between Iran, the United States, and Israel had reached a breaking point. What started as strategic warnings and political threats had now escalated into direct attacks on one of the most critical arteries of global trade, the oil routes of the Persian Gulf. Reports confirmed that multiple tankers had been targeted using drones, explosive boats, and missile strikes, marking a dangerous shift in modern warfare. As flames consumed parts of the vessels, emergency signals flooded maritime channels, nearby ships halted movement, ports shut down operations. Within hours, hundreds of vessels were stranded, afraid to move through waters that had suddenly turned into a battlefield. Inside command centers across the world, screens lit up. In Washington, military officials gathered urgently. Satellite feeds confirmed what many had feared. Iran had begun targeting oil shipments in the Gulf as part of a broader strategy to choke global supply lines. The Strait of Hormuz, through which nearly 20% of the world's oil passes, was now effectively under threat. The United States reacted swiftly. Warships were repositioned. Fighter jets were placed on high alert. Intelligence agencies worked around the clock to assess the scale of the attacks. The message from Washington was clear. Any disruption to global oil supply would be met with a strong response. But the situation was far more complicated than a simple show of force. Iran had carefully chosen its strategy. Instead of direct large-scale confrontation, it focused on economic warfare, targeting oil tankers, infrastructure, and shipping lanes. This approach allowed Tehran to hit its enemies where it hurt the most, without immediately triggering a full-scale invasion. Meanwhile, Israel was watching closely. For Israel, this was not just about oil, it was about survival. Iranian forces and allied groups had already launched attacks targeting Israeli infrastructure and military positions. The tanker strikes were seen as part of a wider plan, a coordinated effort to destabilize the region and stretch Israeli defenses across multiple fronts. Israeli defense systems were activated at maximum capacity. Military leaders in Tel Aviv began preparing for scenarios that could include strikes deep inside Iranian territory. Intelligence reports suggested that Iran was not acting alone. Regional allies and proxy forces were also involved, creating a network of threats that extended far beyond the Gulf. Back in the waters of the Persian Gulf, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. One tanker, heavily damaged, burned uncontrollably as its crew abandoned ship. Another drifted helplessly, its communication systems destroyed. Rescue teams worked desperately to evacuate survivors while avoiding further attacks. The fear was no longer just about one incident, it was about a pattern. And that pattern was becoming clear. Iran was signaling that it could shut down global oil supply at will. The economic impact was immediate. Oil prices surged dramatically, reaching levels not seen in years. Analysts warned that if the Strait of Hormuz remained blocked, prices could skyrocket even further, potentially crippling economies worldwide. Stock markets reacted with volatility. Governments began releasing emergency reserves. Energy-dependent nations scrambled to secure alternative supply routes. But there was no easy solution. The Gulf is not just another shipping lane, it is the heart of global energy trade. Any prolonged disruption would have consequences far beyond the region. Inside Iran, officials defended their actions. They argued that the attacks were a response to ongoing military pressure from the United States and Israel. Iranian commanders made it clear, as long as their country remained under threat, they would not allow oil to flow freely through the region. It was a bold statement, and a dangerous one, because it meant the crisis was far from over. As the days passed, the attacks continued. More vessels were targeted, explosions became more frequent, shipping companies began suspending operations entirely, insurance costs for tankers skyrocketed, making it nearly impossible for companies to operate in the region. The Persian Gulf was slowly turning into a no-go zone. In response, the United States began discussing military options. One proposal involved escorting oil tankers with naval fleets, ensuring safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Another, more aggressive plan considered direct strikes on Iranian military infrastructure, including key oil export hubs. There was even talk of targeting Iran's Karg Island, a strategic location responsible for a significant portion of its oil exports. But experts warned that such a move could escalate the conflict dramatically, putting American troops at risk and potentially triggering a full-scale war. The world stood at a crossroads. Diplomacy was still on the table, but trust was rapidly disappearing. Every new attack made negotiations more difficult. Every explosion pushed the region closer to war. Meanwhile, ordinary people were already feeling the impact. Fuel prices began rising globally. Transportation costs increased, food prices started to climb. What was happening in the Gulf was no longer just a regional conflict, it was a global crisis. And yet, beneath all the chaos, there was a deeper strategy unfolding. Iran was not just fighting a military battle, it was fighting an economic one. By targeting oil tankers, it was sending a message not just to the United States and Israel, but to the entire world. That stability in the Middle East cannot be taken for granted. That any attempt to isolate Iran would come at a cost, a very high cost. As night fell once again over the Persian Gulf, the fires from damaged tankers still burned on the horizon. Smoke rose into the sky, visible from miles away, a constant reminder of how fragile global stability had become. Warships patrolled the waters. Drones circled overhead, and somewhere in the darkness, new threats were already moving into position. The question was no longer whether the conflict would escalate. The question was how far it would go. Would diplomacy succeed in calming the situation? Or would the world witness one of the most dangerous conflicts of the modern era? For now, the Gulf remained on edge, and the world watched, waiting for the next move. Because in this new kind of war, the battlefield was not just land or air. It was the global economy itself, and every tanker, every explosion, every decision made in distant capitals was shaping the future of millions. This was no longer just a story about oil. This was a story about power, survival, and the fragile balance that holds the world together. And as the flames continued to burn across the waters of the Gulf, one thing became clear: the crisis had only just begun.